magic and wonder. A mountain stood tall, reaching up high to the heavens. The interior was hollow, however, filled with dwarves. These dwarves mined away deep underground, searching for various gems and minerals. The dwarves thrived on these resources, creating any tools they needed with them or selling them for other goods. And the dwarves were happy with this life, adventuring deep into the bowels of the earth. However, whilst his kin were asleep, there was one dwarf who was up and awake. Most dwarves like to look down at the rocks and stones they were mining. This one, though, he liked to sneak out of the dwarven lair, and he looked up at the sky. He liked to look at the stars, filling the otherwise empty night sky. He especially liked to look at the round lady of the night, the moon. Nothing encapsulates him more than the moon. It was his dream to be able to fly there. Sometimes he wished he could just reach up and grab it, only to admire it even closer in his palm. He always pondered, how could a dwarf fly so high? He did this every night, or at least he wished he did. He could only go out when his kin don't notice him sneaking out of his quarters. The other dwarfs believe it to be a foolish desire. After all, no dwarf could ever reach the skies. So there he just sat, looking at the bright, round orb in the sky. Although, this particular night, was the moon shining brighter than usual? Bluer, perhaps? Perhaps he had just been in the mines for too long. Suddenly, he felt like he saw movement in the corner of his eye. His gaze darted towards where he thought he saw something. But there was nothing. How strange. He didn't see anything, but he still feels like he's being watched. Like something is approaching him. He drew his war pickaxe in anticipation of an attack. There. There! The rustling of leaves in the bushes. Something was moving inside of it. It didn't seem huge. It was something around his size. It didn't seem like a big threat, so he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let his stargazing be interrupted by some wild animal. "Show yourself," the dwarf called out, and he waited patiently for a reply. The rustling in the bushes. The rustling in the bushes continued until... Squee! Whee! Gah! What the dwarf fell on his back and dropped his pickaxe in shock as a giant rabbit-like creature appeared right next to him. It had dark fur with patches of brown fur, and it wore a hooded cape. With the dwarf backed against the wall, the big rabbit inched closer and closer towards him. But it seemed like it was not going to do any harm. It had an adorable look of curiosity in its face. The dwarf, although frightened at first, began to calm down and get up on his feet. Then he extended an arm towards the bunny that was almost his size. The bunny recognized this gesture and happily accepted the dwarf's head pats, nuzzling at his hand. The dwarf let out a sigh of relief. Coming out of the bushes was another similarly sized bunny, although this one was wearing a robe. Its fur was brown. Its fur was brown, thicker and fluffier. Seeing its fellow bunny being patted by the dwarf allowed it to approach in a less cautious manner. The dwarf reached out too to pat this bunny, but the bunny was friendlier than anticipated, rubbing its face directly against his. The dwarf could only chuckle at the bunny's cuteness. This was turning out to be a magical night for him. Suddenly, the bunny's attention was brought elsewhere, as their ears swivel and eyes gaze off into the distance. The hooded bunny bolts away, while the robed one stood its ground. Only after a while did the dwarf also begin to hear footsteps approaching their area. It was a wolf. It was a werewolf, standing tall and mighty, growling at the bunny and the dwarf. Its razor-sharp teeth were showing, and its claws were unsheathed. It had never seen a bunny so big before, but evidently, from the drool dripping from its mouth, it was hungry, and it was ready to fight for food. The dwarf grabbed the war pick he dropped earlier and stood in front of the robed bunny. "Stay behind me. I've got this." He was ready to defend his newly made friends. The bunny stayed behind the dwarf, closing its eyes. Despite the situation, it looked calm. It seemed like it was getting ready to do something. It seemed like it was getting ready for something, or to do something. It seemed like it was getting ready to do something. And before the werewolf could attack, BAM! And before the werewolf could attack, BAM! The hooded bunny jumped out of the bushes and stabbed the werewolf in the back. Dashing from behind him, the robed bunny ran towards the werewolf, suddenly wielding a quarterstaff. Dashing from behind the dwarf, Dashing from behind the dwarf, the road bunny ran towards the werewolf, suddenly wielding a quarterstaff, and began delivering powerful blows with expertly executed martial arts. The dwarf could also join in on the fight, but he was too astonished. The dwarf could also join in on the fight, but he was too oh my god. The dwarf could also join in on the fight, but he was too astonished. He just stood there, speechless, spectating. After that, After that, the werewolf... Oh my god, why am I so bad at reading? After that, the werewolf could only flee, whimpering with bruises and dagger wounds all over its body. The robed bunny shrunk its magical quarterstaff down and sheathed it within its robe. The hooded bunny ran around the other in circles, as if doing victory laps around his bunny companion. After the dwarf processed what his eyes had seen, he was even more enthralled by these bunnies. What kind of rabbits are you? I mean, how the hell did you do that? The bunnies looked at each other, then pounced off down the mountainside. Wait, where are you going? The hooded bunny looks back at the dwarf and squeaks. Looks? Are you kidding me? The hooded bunny looked back at the dwarf and squeaked, as if beckoning him. The hooded bunny looked back at the dwarf and squeaked, as if beckoning him over. And so the dwarf follows behind them, going further than he's ever gone. At the foot of the forest... Oh dear God, I hate my life. At the foot of the mountain was a forest, rich with life. Vines growing on trees, insects pollinating the flowers, and little critters skittering across the forest floor. It seemed like a safe haven for the bunnies, and evidently it was their home, as they seemed very familiar with this magical place. The bunnies entered the region as if they knew every tree that grew within it. As the dwarf stepped into the threshold of the forest, it was as if the sound of a twig snapping resonated through the forest, as all the small animals retreated to their hiding spots. Meanwhile, vines began to grow and entangle the dwarf's law. Meanwhile, vines began to grow. Oh my god. I cannot fucking read for shit. Meanwhile, vines began to grow and entangle the dwarf's legs, keeping him in place. State your purpose, dwarf. A loud voice calls from... Everything is ruining my... State your purpose, dwarf. A loud voice called out from multiple directions, as if coming from all the trees. The bunnies led me here. I saw the two of them fight off a werewolf, and I just wanted to know how that was possible. A figure emerged from one of the trees. It was a human? No, a half-elf. Definitely a druid, with the connection she has with nature. She was tall, especially by dwarf standards, wearing simple clothing and had long, lustrous orange-brown hair. The bunnies flopped beside her and rubbed her side. She replied by giving them both some headpats. "All right, come on in," she said with a much softer, friendlier voice. The vines creeped off the dwarf, allowing "All right, come on in," she said with a much softer, friendlier voice. The vines creeped off from the dwarf, allowing him to move, and so the dwarf cautiously enters. And so the dwarf cautiously entered the vicinity of the forest. "The name's Bryony, by the way. You're that dwarf from the night. You're that dwarf from the mountain that keeps looking at the night. You're that dwarf from the mountain that keeps looking at the sky. You're that dwarf from the mountain that keeps looking at the stars at night." The dwarf was slightly surprised by how Bryony knew of him. The dwarf was slightly surprised by how... Okay. The dwarf was slightly taken aback by how Bryony knew of him. The dwarf was slightly surprised by how Bryony... I hate my life. The dwarf was taken aback by how Bryony knew of him. Yes, that's me. I dig holes by day and look at the moon by night." "Ah, yes, we've noticed. Jerry and Fionn like to wander around at night before they go to sleep, and they often see you on the mountainside, staring at the sky," the half-elf said, while sitting down in a comfy spot. The dwarf followed suit. "Jerry and Fionn? Are those—" "Yes, they're my bunnies. This one's Jerry." She pats the floofy brown bunny beside her. "And that one's Fionn," she says, looking towards the dark-furred bunny, who was hopping happily around by itself. "Don't worry, she does that. Anyway, these two have always been bunnies of this forest. These two have always been bunnies of this forest. The two met while they were little kids, and they're inseparable. I'd say they're partners for life." Fionn hops over to Jerry and Fionn hops over to Jerry, and they do a little kiss. The dwarf looks... Oh my god. The dwarf looks on. Fionn hopped over to Jerry, and they did a little kiss. The dwarf looked on and let out a high-pitched "Ah!" When they were younger, they were just like any other bunny. Small, cute, and harmless. I mean, they're still cute now. But imagine how adorable they were back then. Oh, I can't imagine. But I do like them as they are now. I am a dwarf who likes big butts. Oh. Oh. I can imagine. But I do like them as they are now. I am a dwarf who likes big buns. Phryne chuckles a bit at the joke. Perhaps in another world you could make a good jester. The dwarf couldn't tell if she was being genuine or just being kind. As I was saying, they were normal bunnies in the past, but one night something peculiar happened. After the bunnies had returned home from their evening stroll, I realized that they had grown almost 10 times in size. I knew immediately that strong magics were in play. From where? I still don't know to this day. The bunnies themselves couldn't remember. Okay. As I was saying, they were normal bunnies in the past, but one night, something peculiar happened. After the bunnies had returned home from their evening stroll, I noticed that they had grown almost 10 times in size. I knew immediately that strong magics were in play. From where? I still don't know to this day. The bunnies themselves couldn't remember. The dwarf's eyes widened slightly at the statement. Yes, I can talk to my bunnies, as well as any animal. Yes, I can talk to my bunnies, as well as any other animal in this forest. They told me about how you were going to protect Jerry, by the way, and also how you were stunned when you figured out they could handle themselves. And also how you were stunned when you told me. They told me about how you were going to protect Jerry, by the way, and also how you were stunned when you figured out that they could handle themselves. The dwarf squinted at the two bunnies, who made squeaking noises. The dwarf squinted at the bunnies. Oh my god. The dwarf squinted at the two bunnies, who made squeaking noises, as if they were kicking. Oh my god. The dwarf squinted at the two bunnies, who made squeaking noises, as if they were giggling to themselves. Anyway, back then I had to focus on dispelling this affliction on the bunnies. I was successful on removing the magic from them, but it turned out that the effects were more permanent than I thought. I was successful in removing the magic from them, but it turned out the effects were more permanent than I anticipated. I tried to look for more ways to return them to their original states, but as time went on, the more I accepted that this was how this is how things shall be. Of course, now that they are much larger, they have become Of course, now that they are much larger, my god. Of course, not that they are much larger. They have become larger target. Oh my god. Of course, not that they are much larger. They have become much larger targets for predators. Which is why I taught them to defend themselves. You taught the bunnies how to fight? Yes. Is that such a surprise? The bunnies had to learn from somewhere, and I seemed to be the only option. They had to be able to fight off the smaller, more basic predators that would patrol around the forest. But the longer training went on, the more powerful the big... But the longer training went on, the more powerful the bunnies became. I also noticed that they had become much smarter than regular bunnies. Never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that my bunnies could take on a werewolf. That's brilliant. Ordinary bunnies that could eventually fight off a werewolf. Nobody could have imagined that. Listening to the tale of the bunnies, the dwarf couldn't help but get inspired by them. How they could become so powerful, beyond anyone's comprehension. He promptly got up to hurry out of the forest, but not without He promptly got up to hurry out of the forest, but not without saying He promptly got up to hurry out of the forest, but not without saying oh my god. He promptly got up to hurry out of the forest, but not without saying some final remarks. Bryony, thank you so much for telling me the story of your bunnies. Bryony, thank you so much for telling me the story of your bunnies. It is an incredible tale. Now, it is time that I make my own tale. Wait, you haven't even told me your name yet, and you're leaving already? Wait, you haven't even told me your name yet, and you're leaving already? Oh, how sorry of me. Oh, sorry. How rude of me. My name is Honeydew. I don't know how, but I'm going to the moon. The end.